Good afternoon. I'm Iris Wilbur-Glick, president of the Louisville Forum, and welcome to our June meeting. We typically meet on the second Wednesday of each month at Vincenzo's restaurant in downtown Louisville, and all are welcome. Founded in 1984, the Louisville Forum is a nonpartisan public issues group that hosts debates and discussions of contemporary and sometimes controversial public policy issues that affect the greater Louisville community. For more information on the Louisville Forum, our programs, or to make reservations, please visit louisvilleforum.org. Today's program, What is Wokeism and its Impact on Policy, Politics, and Culture? You don't have to search very far to find numerous social media posts and news headlines referencing the term woke. Louisville and throughout Kentucky, we've actually seen those instances right here in our backyard, whether it's debate or controversy, not just national observations, but actually right here in Louisville. A quick Google search and you can find a number of Kentucky outlets covering the most recent Kentucky legislative session where policymakers were debating the impacts of woke agendas in public education. Then turn your attention to just a few news cycles ago where the idea of wokeness has already occupied a lot of airtime and within sound bites of presidential contenders. These have ranged from complaints of what is it and the dialogue on is there a war on woke? And that is how we arrived at today's conversation. What does it mean to be woke? What is the woke movement? And if and how it draws an ideology on race and LGBTQ plus issues. So instead of debating pro, anti, wokeism, let's dive in and see how it is impacting public policy, political elections, and the world around us. Today, I'm honored to introduce our panel. We have Dr. Ricky L. Jones, a professor and chair of the University of Louisville's Department of Pan-African Studies. Attended the U.S. Naval Academy and Morehouse College, holds a PhD in political science from UK, where he specialized
here we go.
in political philosophy and comparative politics. He is an author, he is an author in addition to a political analyst and columnist. With us also is Dr. Wilfred Reilly. He is an associate professor of political science at Kentucky State University. He holds a PhD in political science from Southern Illinois University and a law degree from the University of Illinois. He is an author and also a columnist and a commentary in a numerous amounts or a number of other journals and magazines, but notable academic questions and commentary. And to help facilitate today's discussion, we have with us radio and television personality, the one, the only, Terry Miners. Needs no introduction. And with that, please join me in welcoming our featured speakers. And with that, Terry, take it away.
Thanks, Iris. Is this the loudest one of these intros has ever been? That's good. That's the way this thing needs to be. I'm so glad to see everybody here. And discussion is the gift of life. I mean, that's it. That's what we're all here for. It's 7 billion of us on this planet, and people pick at each other over little things, this or that or whatever. And it's really, we're all the same scared rabbits. We're all breathing every day, hoping it's not our last. So let's try to understand each other a little bit better. And this woke term has been divisive, or divisive, as some of the academicians like to say. I like to use that word around you. Both of you guys, I'm sure, have plenty to say. I can tell you this, in my job, I'm coming up on 38 years on my show on WHAS, and I hear, thank you, oof. They can't find another dummy to do what I do, I think. But I have been fortunate enough to speak with people from all walks of life. And, you know, Ricky and I, we'll get on and start yammering about something or other. And then I start getting, Ricky knows because we share them all the time. Some of these people write in and you're like, wow, what kind of a rock do you live under? I mean, I'm amazed at the heat that comes out of some people because of just a misunderstanding or a lack of understanding, or just they hear a phrase or a word like woke, and then it sets off another set of fireworks in their brain, and they have to respond in this acerbic fashion. And I think that's just so overblown. I enjoy the gift of being able to chat, and most importantly, to listen. So you all know I love this guy. We've got a long history together. I'm sorry, we've just met Dr. Reilly, and I'm glad to have you here. I read you in National Review. I mean, that's an impressive place to put your thoughts and words. So, good place for you to start. We're going to, since you're our kind of guest, you're playing on his home court, but we're not really debating. We're just having discussions and thoughts on wokeism. So take it away, Dr. Reilly.
All right, we got a really high bro quotient up here on the panel. I haven't done my college shout out, so ILLINI.
Let's go!
Yeah, woof. I don't really feel like holding the mic for the 10-minute intro or whatever, so I'm just going to lean forward and talk, I guess. But the theme of today's event is what is woke? And I think that there are a lot of nonsense answers often given to that, but there's a very simple, real one. And I'll start with some of the ones that you often hear. So American leftists, like David Hogg, the witty young activist, often try when writing to brand being woke as basically just quote-unquote being good or being kind. My casual friend and occasional Twitter sparring partner, Nina Turner, dropped the old stay woke line yesterday and said that being woke is just being black and aware that racism exists. And I guess the question when this is done is who could oppose that? And this is true of any political slogan, choose life. On the other hand, I think that many people on kind of the hard body right would be very inclined to say that anything to the left of Genghis Khan is woke communism. Newt Gingrich argued a couple days back that Democrats would make the whole country drink Bud Light, shop at Target, and wear rainbow underwear, I believe was the quote, if they could, to make their base feel better.
Where'd the Bud Light part come in?
Well, Bud Light, remember Bud Light, Dylan Mulvaney was one of Bud Light's top 30 endorsers this year, so people start, well, actually, this is a family audience, so I'm not going to go into the names. You might hear from them in a bar and all that. But I will say Modelo Especial is now the #1 beer in America, passing Bud Light, so interesting stuff going on there. A great replacement, if you will. But anyhow, so I think that as thinkers and taxpayers, we can leave all of this stuff aside and get a definition of wokeness from the people in the movement, which I would define as the American progressive through revolutionary left. And the definition which I got that way, and which has survived pretty well in academic and public intellectual articles so far, is that quote-unquote wokeness is the idea that first, American society is currently and intentionally structured to oppress. The target group might vary. So in women's studies or feminist theory, it's structured to oppress women for the benefit of men. So for example, I recently read an article arguing that marriage was an institution designed to let men obtain as much sex as possible. But I mean, you have black studies, you have queer theory, so on down the line. Society is currently and intentionally structured to oppress. 2, any gaps in performance or treatment between groups indicate this oppression. This is, for example, Dr. Ibram Kendi. And 3, the solution to any gaps like this is equity, which really means proportional representation regardless of performance, when you look at equitable grading or equitable college admissions. And all of this is pretty canonical. The idea about the quote-unquote bigoted structure of society comes from Delgado and Stefanchik's foundational book on critical race theory, which is called critical race theory. So racism is everywhere, every day, it's intentional, you didn't imagine it, is a famous quote there. The claim that all group gaps indicate bigotry is the core idea of what made my man Ibram Kendi famous. His argument is that the only 2 possible explanations for any such gap are racism, no matter how subtle and hard to find, 1, and 2, quote-unquote, inferiority, by which I think he means actual genetic inferiority. So Dr. Kendi's proposed solution to any difference in group representation in any field, away from the proportional. So Asian overrepresentation in college, I would assume, black overrepresentation in sport, is what he describes as a National Department of Anti-Racism, or a National Department of Equity staffed by experts in racism, to use his term, that would adjust for this problem. that would deal with it, that would make things equal again. And getting to the point, pretty much everything that you might think of as woke, from the Black Lives Matter movement's take on disproportionate police shooting rates, to the claim that trans people are denied the same services as other women we saw recently made in Louisville and Cincinnati, that falls here. Now, as many of you probably know, I'm fairly anti-woke. I'm a well-known heretical and right-leaning writer. And the problem that I have with this theory, and I assume I have like 1 or 2 minutes left since we've got 2 other guys up here that are going to talk, but I mean, is that I frankly think it's often pretty silly. We all want to remedy the harms done by past racism, but these sort of claims, all differences are due to X, are just not true, and insisting on it can get almost dumb. So to make a few obvious points, I mean, if we look at some basic metric like income, either 7 or 8, depending on how you count South Africans, of the 10 most successful groups in the USA right now aren't white. Asians, South Asians, like Indian Americans, Black immigrants, like Nigerians, currently the best educated group in the country by far, all out-earned the white average in most years. Appalachian whites, I will note to a Kentucky audience, earn about as much as what most people would think of as Black Americans, ADOS, American descendants of slaves. There's also about a 200 to 300% variance, if I recall correctly, within the white category. So the high, and to me, a lot of these terms are pretty meaningless anyway, but that's a different point. The highest earning white groups, like Jewish and Australian Americans, Australians surprised me a little bit, make 2 to 3 times as much money as poorer groups like Cajuns and recent immigrants. No one can really peg any of this to America being a Korean or Australian supremacist society. So what causes it? Well, in reality, there are a ton of things that predict how individuals and groups do. The modal average age, the most common age for a black guy, is 27. For a white male, it's 58. Something like 70% of Hispanics, Latinos, live in the inland Southwest or South, where wages are lower. It's about 15% for otherwise similar Italian Americans, like a lot of the guys I grew up with in Chicago. You can break these differences down into categories. There are cultural variables like study time and athletic practice time. Asian kids study about 3 times as much as Southern black or white kids, which I don't think would surprise a ton of people here. There are regional variables like the income difference in the agrarian South. Okay, I'm gonna have to get rid of some of this. But historical variables like past racism that no longer exists obviously affects the black community, the reason we have less wealth in general. Systemic but not racial variables, so welfare policy targeted big blue cities first. That had massive impacts on families in a lot of the urban north. Stochastic or just random things like that age figure that I gave. I don't really want to just go on here, but I and many, many others, Tom Sowell, June O'Neill, Walter Williams, young writers like Rav Aurora, William Julius Wilson for that matter, find that when you adjust for these sort of things using the basic regression analysis that probably very many people here can do, not just racial gaps, but many things you hear about, like women, quote unquote, making 59 cents to the male dollar, basically just vanish. So in short, there obviously is bias in society. There's a legacy of racism in the USA. There's also a modern reality where the country of 2023 is 41% quote-unquote POC, people of color. We desegregated in 1954, at least formally. Most discrimination's been civilly, often criminally as a lawyer, illegal since '64. Pro-minority affirmative action has been the law of the land since 1967, the Philadelphia Plan. 90% of people of all races don't test as bigots. So we'll get into the many privileges that exist later, but woke arguments strike me as definable and very often wrong. But what wokeness is to me is the idea, 1, 2, 3, society is still structured to oppress, and we can tell that by looking at this one thing, differences between people.
All right, Dr. Reilly, appreciate that.
I need my microphone. I'm a professional after all. All right, appreciate all that recitation.
I'm a talented amateur.
There you go. Dr. Ricky Jones has been fan of chair of Pan-African Studies at the University of Louisville, and I know you're staying on as a professor now. You just left that role, so
Yeah, I'll be chair for 16 more days, thank God.
16 more. All right. So this concept of woke, you've written lots of columns too. I've seen you on CNN, other things. So you get into this topic as well. What is your overall take on the concept of woke, what it means, and why people throw it around so much in political commercials?
Well, let me do a couple of things, and I don't want to take the entire 10 minutes. I certainly want to welcome, our dear brother Reilly to the city. Do you live here, brother?
No, I live in Frankfurt.
You live in Frankfurt. Welcome to the city. Frankfurt is 30 minutes away. Sometimes it seems 30 years away from Louisville. But good city. We're both political scientists. We both probably have a healthy disdain for politics from the left and the right. But I want to address something before we get started here because I think it's really, really important. I have been fascinated. I'm an Atlanta kid. You're a Chicagoan.
Original.
I'm an Atlanta kid, not some dyed-in-the-wool, blue-blood academic. I grew up in the housing projects of Atlanta, born to a 15-year-old mother, raised by a grandmother who couldn't read. I know both sides of it. I don't just, study black people. I've lived, that experience. So when I say I'm from Atlanta, I'm not saying I'm from Dunwoody or Alpharetta or all these outlying areas. I'm actually from the inner city. And then I went forward on to the U.S. Naval Academy and Martin Luther King Jr. School at Morehouse College. But I want to tell you something that is really important, I think, for myself and for Brother Reilly as we move forward in this discussion about woke and other things that'll come up in this. It was made known to me that there was intense pushback from the Louisville Forum about the speaker's lineup and maybe even the topic today. I'm not sure if that targeted me or Brother Reilly or both. But I will say something that I find incredibly problematic about Louisville and maybe the state in general. I think it's something that is infecting America, is the culture of silence and the culture of fear. No matter how much you disagree with someone, and this is the beauty of academia, we are a marketplace of ideas where people come together, discuss those ideas, have healthy debate, and the better ones survive the day. We really believe in Hegel's dialectic of a thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. So I'm not sure what people thought was going to happen today, but I want to assure you that I have absolutely no interest in engaging in some type of spectacle where I'm attacking another brother, and I'm sure he doesn't either. We come from a culture where debate is healthy even if we disagree. You have children, brother?
No.
Not yet, but you will at some point, hopefully. Both of us, even though we may have different...
Oh, possibly.
Yeah. but let me tell you why I asked him if he had children, as we talk about being woke. What being woke is to me, I don't disagree with the fundamental definition. What being woke is really about, to my thinking, is being educated. It's having a strong understanding of American history, having a strong understanding of the development of American politics. And when I talk about politics, I'm not just talking about going to the voters box. I'm talking about Harold Laswell's definition of politics when he said politics is the process that decides who gets what, when, where, and how. It is fundamentally an engagement of power, of people being able to define their reality, not just for themselves in their lifetimes, but for the well-being of their children. And so if you don't understand, one, the history of race in this country, when you talk about the black-white divide. Now, I'm a political philosopher by training, but I have worked in a black studies department for 27 years. That has been by choice. Why? Because I am fundamentally concerned with the well-being of black people. And yes, black folk are underrepresented. Only about 5 to 6% of the American professorate is black. And no, we're not all affirmative action babies. I was listening to this fascinating podcast, which I encourage you all to listen to. Slow Burn. They take a whole season to engage one topic. This season, from Slate, they're looking at Justice Clarence Thomas. It does a very deep dive in the walk to that brother's development. And I'm not casting aspersions on Brother Thomas at all here. But he talks about the attacks that he took from the left, from what you might call the right, and even from his own, from white kids, from black kids who were so miseducated, as Carter G. Woodson would say, that they were calling him ABC, America's Blackest Child, as a young kid. Through his talent, he made it into Yale Law School, but had many of the white liberals at the school did not think that he belonged at Yale Law School because they saw him as an affirmative action admit, no matter how talented he was. So it's not about his politics. So what do I say about children? I was talking to a University Board of Trustees chair and a college president, two white women, who were talking about, and they admitted that white privilege exists. And they were telling all these examples of how their privilege had benefited them over the years. And I said to them, I've never experienced that. But what I do, everything that I do, is so that my daughter, who is a young black woman, can experience some of the same privilege that you've experienced all of your life and taken for granted. That's what all of our work is really about. So this is not just about the past sins of racism. Racism still exists. It's not just about the past sin of structural racism. It still exists. I understand the argument that people say pull yourself up by your own bootstraps and all of this is about individual achievement. My point is, I think Brother Reilly and myself have the same aspirations for America moving forward, but we may have different paths to getting there. And we'll talk about that today in a decent way. But I want to make it clear for folks who push back against myself or him being here. Speaking at the Louisville Forum as a Morehouse graduate in the tradition of King and Julian Bond and Maynard Jackson and Spike Lee, this is not a great aspiration for me, nor is it a great honor. It was a favor for a former student. So that's targeted toward particular people. You know who you are. Shame on you. Let's have this debate or talk or educational session about what being woke is, because what this really is another propaganda tagline that really is rooted in historic and contemporary racism. Just like any black person that speaks against structural racism must be a member of BLM. I'm not a member of BLM. I never have been. Everything that we teach must be critical race theory. I challenge most politicians from this state and across the country who talk about critical race theory to even legitimately define it. You can't have an intelligent conversation about it. They can anyway. Hopefully today we can. So let's move forward with this and hopefully get to Terry's questions, which are always penetrating, and questions from you so that we can talk about these things. Thank you very much.
All right, Ricky, thank you. Dr. Reilly, thank you. Why is the woke element so heavily used now in political commercials? I'm just asking both of you, gentlemen. Is this just another concept that's come up to keep divisiveness strong because there's a payoff for people who use it? Ricky, you want to start on that?
Sure. If you understand history, one, there's always this talk, which I find incredibly fascinating, that we're more divided than we've ever been. And, you hear this from the left and the right, the politicians anyway. And it's a lie. It's just not true. I mean, this is the same country that went through slavery. We're pretty divided during slavery. And not just divided along lines of race, but also divided ideologically. You can't talk about the abolitionist movement just in strict racial terms. You had people like William Lloyd Garrison. Last time I checked, he was white. You had people like John Brown, who said historically of slavery, I have a system to destroy, and I have no time to waste. Last time I checked, John Brown was white. Now, certainly people go back and say, oh, John Brown was crazy. John Brown really believed in equality. He believed in freedom. right? So this country was deeply divided along those lines. But when you talk about this woke movement, Terry, this is just the anti-woke movement. This is the latest iteration of retrenchment pushback to true dedication to freedom, liberty, equality, and forming a truly raceless, multiracial society. That's what it really is. So when you get, after the Civil War, you had pushback, right? You had pushback in ideology, you had pushback in policy. You had things like grandfather clauses. You had things like poll taxes. You had things like literacy tests. You had things like voter intimidation. You had outright violence. Remember, the Ku Klux Klan is a post-Civil War phenomenon, not a pre-Civil War phenomenon. You get to 1896, Plessy versus Ferguson. That's pushback. That's branding black people as barbaric, as violent, and people to be feared, especially black men who wanted to swoop in and whisk all the white women away and ravish them. And that's coming from a black man who's never dated a white woman. We do exist, right? And so that's not something that's been going on forever. One of my white friends said, if you look at the history of violence in this hemisphere, maybe throughout the world, this is a white friend that said this, white guy. Yes, I do have white friends.
It was him.
It wasn't him that said it. He's not insightful enough to say this. This guy said to me, he said, if you really look at the history of the world and the history of violence, guys who look like me have been the most violent animals ever to walk the face of the earth. But we've convinced everybody that guys who look like you are. That was jarring. But when you take that in, then you understand the disproportionate representation of black men and other men of color in America's criminal justice system and in the prison industrial complex. It's just tossed aside. You understand our underrepresentation when you talk about schooling and all of these things. So we'll get deeper into that, but this is just another tag, right? As Christopher Rufo said, and he brilliantly said it, we have frozen their brand. Everything that they say about racial disparities in this country, we're now going to brand it as critical race theory. And how was he rewarded? He was put on a board of trustees in the state of Florida by Governor Ron DeSantis, and immediately the DE officer there was fired, the provost resigned, the direction of the school went along a different path. And so you may think that's good, you may think it's bad, but to make the argument that not just individual racism, but that structural racism no longer exists in America, that would be intellectually dishonest.
Dr. Reilly, why is the term woke thrown around so frequently in commercials as a positioning statement for someone running for office?
That's a great question. I think there's quite a lot there. I mean, first I would say historically, people that look like Genghis Khan were probably the most violent conquerors of all time or whatnot. I mean, if you look at history, there's a fair amount of brutality to go around for everyone. It's worth noting that until about 1954, we would think of almost everyone that was alive as a savage. I mean, women got the right to vote in 1920 in the USA, and we were one of the leading countries in the world. So, yeah, I think we all support on the panel the right of the distaff, half of the human race, to vote. Radical position. But, I mean, the basic point here that when we look back at the depths of history and talk about the atrocities of white Americans or Native Americans or something like that, it's worth noting that those were part of the long tradition of the atrocities of all of mankind until extraordinarily recently. And in fact, one of the greater accomplishments of Western civilization was ending quite a few of these. I mean, the impetus for ending the global slave trade did not come from, say, the Islamic world or the highly developed civilizations of sub-Saharan Africa, Ghana, Songhai, Mali, and so on down the line. At one point, the Ashanti Kingdom actually petitioned the British Empire to keep slave trading going globally. So I don't really see any reason to feel particularly guilty about the fact that humans are all predatory, sharp-toothed apes and sometimes act like it. I feel no particular guilt about the deeds of my ancestors because I didn't have much to do with them. At any rate, though, but going on to why wokeness is currently a popular buzzword in advertisements, I actually agree with the good doc on a fair amount of this. I think that people like short, punchy lines to use in ads. So woke is a good target point. I will note that both sides do this. The left-wing equivalent would probably be racist or Nazi, something like that. I mean, another pitch from the right would be groomer. I mean, you want something that's usually under 8 letters long, I would say, from the few quantitative studies I've looked at, that you can hang on your opponent. So there is that reality. But there also is an objective, fact-based reality that underlies this. So, like, one of the things that I look at when I do quantitative work is the surprising reality that race relations are getting worse in the USA. Like, throughout the entire quote-unquote DEI era, as versus that reasonably colorblind kind of Jordan Bird era, they've been measurably getting worse. I mean, in 2000, there was a major study done. I believe this might be corrected by the other panelists, but it was done by Pew, surveyed a couple 100,000 people, and they asked blacks, whites, Latinos, how they felt about the state of American race relations. And 70% of whites, 65% African Americans, that's about the split I'd expect, by the way, given continuing residual racism and so on, thought they were quite good. They did the same thing a couple of years ago following the beginning of the BLM movement, the Ferguson riots, Proud Boys founding, a couple of other things. And I think it was 33% of blacks, 34% of whites thought they were good. So there is a practical problem, which is that the current era of race obsession seems to have produced worse race relations. It's an actual measurable fact. And I think a lot of people are backlashing against this. So very often when I talk to a smart person that's on the political left, they say something like, well, you oppose DEI. What you oppose is our enhancing the civil rights movement and moving forward to a colorblind society. And I've got to tell you, when I read like Robin DiAngelo, Ibram Kendi, that's not what I see them talking about. What I see them talking about is constant race obsession going on into the foreseeable future, like measured and ranked forever. Like when you talk about unending affirmative action, so like when we talk about systemic racism, there are systems, you could argue policing after dark in the South or something, where that term might have some meaning. But in academia, if you're looking at collegiate admissions, it's very hard to argue that admission to college is systemically racist against minorities. The last time I looked, there's about a 300-point SAT edge if you're a black guy as versus an Asian guy. This is just a fact. Harvard's currently being sued because there's such an enormous advantage for black, Latino, Native, and even white applicants as versus Asian American and South Asian applicants. So like when people say, I think that system's a little unfair, you should maybe give a 50-point advantage to poor kids, and other than that, we should just look at grades and test scores. The people that are saying B aren't necessarily the people that are obsessing about race. I mean, this is just an obvious statement of fact. It's just for some bizarre reason considered politically incorrect to say. So I think that there are two things. One, the other panelists are absolutely correct that we're the right is as bad with the labels as the left, but there also really is a reality of racial conflict that's very often being promoted from the left that people are reacting to. I mean, you can dislike Chris Rufo's reaction to it, but I mean, like, a final line, because I think we're all doing pretty well, like, spacing out everyone's talking. But I mean, when you talk about like what Rufo or someone like this would be objecting to is kind of DeSantis's troubleshooter at New College. New College, for example, required every applicant for a faculty job, as I recall, to fill out a diversity and gender support statement. So if you wanted to teach like physics, you would have to express your support for the college's affirmative action policies and quote-unquote transgender inclusion policies, and you'd have to explain how, in your research on quarks and photons, you were going to forward non-binary people of color and so forth. And I might support doing that at some theoretical level, but I mean, DeSantis's final comment when he fired Rufo's final comment when he fired the coordinator in charge of that was go seek productive work. And you can see why someone might think that. So there's a real debate here. It's not that Ibram Kendi is pursuing a beautiful raceless future and Nazis are trying to stop him.
I want to address a few of those things, and there's a lot. First, let me walk it up historically. First of all, I really encourage you all to study what we would call slavery in Africa, because this is a long-standing propaganda lie. What we call slavery existed in Africa, but not in the way that it appeared in the United States. In fact, it was so different that you have what we would call slaves in Africa could be admitted to families as family members. They could inherit land. They could become heads of families. Slavery was not based simply on the color of one's skin as it was in this country. So I won't get too deep into that because that will be a panel on of its own. But I encourage you to actually go read and educate yourselves on the differences between African slavery and American slavery. And there have also been what I think are legitimate discussions in academia among historians. Yes, there were Africans who participated in the slave trade willingly. One, they were not the dominant majority of Africans. Okay? One, remember, Africa is a continent, not a country. Two, it stands to reason since slavery appeared so differently there than here, they didn't know what their enemies were being sold into in this country. Okay? That's the first point. Two, we simply can disagree on who's been the most violent folk historically on the globe. Move on from that. Three, it is not an issue of trying to keep racism alive forever when we talk about the history of freedom, of abolition, even though women's right to vote. Women fought for that right to vote. They had to fight for it fiercely, and I might add, 50 years after by law, black males were given the right to vote with the passage of the 15th Amendment in 1870. It's not until the passage of the 19th Amendment in 1920 that women get the right to vote. But some folk are very comfortable with this false narrative, I think, that America was proactively dedicated to freedom and equality for all people who were not white males. That is a false narrative. People like Harriet Tubman existed who fought for freedom. People like Frederick Douglass existed and fought for freedom. They had white allies like William Lloyd Garrison who fought for freedom, right? The abolitionist movement was real, and there was great pushback. The women's suffrage movement was real with great pushback. You can't go through some quantitative analysis. You know, when I was a senior in college, we read this great book called How to Lie with Statistics. So I would wager, and as political scientists, we both had to take quantitative and qualitative analysis when we were in graduate school. And so I know you can twist numbers. For instance, if somebody said to me, if I had one white student last semester and I had two this semester, and they say, well, Ricky Jones, you know, you just don't teach any white students. I mean, white kids don't want to take your classes. And I could easily come back and say to them, this is not true. In fact, just over the course of this year, my white student population has increased by 100%. I have not lied, but I've misled you, okay? I've misled you. So when you talk about stripping all these other factors away in some, you know, multivariate regression analysis, and race doesn't matter in this country, gender doesn't matter in this country, you're being misled. You are not woke, you're asleep. But to black people specifically, I want to take a little bit more time here since we're talking about numbers, not just with college admission and representation, as we're bleeding black professors in so many schools. We're bleeding black professors at the University of Louisville. Yeah, they got hired, but they're leaving because they hate the environment. I had a young black student tell me this semester, and you all should be concerned about this as Louisvillians if you really want an equal society. Young black girl, brilliant student, who said she was admitted to Howard University, she was admitted to Spelman, she was admitted to FAMU, but she wanted, these are historically black colleges. They're HBCUs. K-State's an HBCU. And she said, Dr. Jones, could you write me a letter of recommendation because I'm leaving U of L? And I said, why? You're doing so well. She said, I chose not to go to black schools because I wanted to stay closer to home, and I wanted to go to U of L, and it was the worst mistake that I ever made. I've spent the year feeling like Ruby Bridges, and I don't want to feel like that anymore. If you didn't know, Ruby Bridges is the little girl who goes to school by herself and has to be escorted by marshals, and there was a great meme as people say, well, we don't want to teach anything about race, really. You know, forget CRT, forget being woke, forget all of that stuff. I'm talking about the true history and contemporary reality of race that we need to know so that we can address it instead of explaining it away. If Ruby Bridges was tough enough to endure living that situation, then I think our white children are tough enough to learn about that situation so they don't repeat it. But we want to talk about numbers. Right now, there's a longitudinal study that was reported on by the AP and a number of other places, okay? And these are scholars not just at FAMU. We're talking about coming out of Yale, coming out of Morehouse, Northwestern, and other schools. Here's some of the hard quantitative numbers coming out of this study about black folk. Today, black women have the highest maternal mortality rate in the United States, 69.9 per 100,000 live births for 2021, almost 3 times the rate for white women. That's according to the Center for Disease Control and Prevention. The 2021 rate was a significant increase from the prior year. The percentage of black children with asthma is far higher than that of white kids. About 50% of black youth experience moderate to severe symptoms of depression. And about 18% said they were exposed to racial trauma often or very often in their lives, starting in elementary school. About 56% of black adults have high blood pressure compared to 48% of whites. Black Americans more likely to develop Alzheimer's disease. These are just health things. Across the board, black people are unlikely to receive the same quality of health care than white people do. We could go on and on and on about these numbers. Right? Admitted to schools less frequently. You want to talk about ACT
The white
or
suicide
SAT?
rate is 4 times the black rate. I mean, it's very easy to do that in any direction.
I didn't interrupt you, brother.
Oh, sorry.
So we can always pick out anomalous numbers, right? Like we can always pick out anomalous achievement. Oprah's rich. So that means all black people or white people gonna function like Oprah? Probably not. But when we look across the board, something is going on from the cradle to the grave with these racial disparities. Now, brother brought it up, and it is a legitimate question for us to ask. Either black people are the most malfeasant black folk that God has ever put on the face of the doggone earth, and that's accounting for all of these ills that many of our people are suffering, or there is something structural going on. Now, people like me, we don't think the playing field is level. We believe that there is something going on that's impacting most black folk. And I'll close this, and I know you say, well, Ricky Jones, you came from the housing projects to become a professor at 28 years old. I am smart as hell, unusually intelligent. But and always been that, was never ashamed of it. But my question is, what happens to the average black kid? Right, who doesn't have that type of superior intelligence from my housing projects? I saw it, and I know it. Let's go forward.
Dr. Reilly.
Yeah, I mean, so some good points there. I will say that there actually is a really easy response to a lot of that, though, and I tried to touch on it earlier. That was very well put. I mean, but no, the two options aren't genetic inferiority and racism. That's the basic mistake. A very simple way to put this is against every measure that he just broke down, Asians and Nigerians smoke white and black people. Does that mean that society is systemically structured to benefit Nigerians? No. I mean, so you get into a whole bunch of different things. Once again, you get into culture. You get into structure. For example, do some people live in area like are black people more likely to live in working poor regions of the South? By the way, when you actually, I wasn't like on Twitter or something, I actually took some notes while the other guys were talking here. So if you want to talk about this idea of quantitative adjustment, I assume many of you in business or whatnot know how to do regression analysis.
Probably not.
You know, I'm going to pretend they do. We're not going to do a math lesson up here. But I mean, basically, it's very simple to open up a program like Stata or SPSS and look at the effect of one thing on another thing
with everything else held constant, pretty much. And I mean, so a lot of stuff, like most of the data I look at really has a pretty low chance of being wrong. And I'm not saying that arrogantly, but like the national polls on race relations, you just ask a bunch of people how they feel about race relations anonymously. Like that's not some complex statistical trickery. Like that's probably just accurate. Whether or not that reflects the fact that there's actually more interracial crime today than in 1967, I'm skeptical about that myself. You know, that is what people think. That does reflect media. That does reflect a lot of the quote-unquote woke and anti-woke debate. That's just a fact. But even when you look at something like the black income figure and you say, well, you're hiding from reality if you do a bunch of these adjustments and say that black and white people turn out equally. You know, how many black guys do you have in your final sample? 5? No, not really. I mean, the 3 adjustments that you use to get to the same income for blacks and whites are age. Again, there's a difference of decades on average. And as that closes, a lot of these things like the crime rate gap are going to close. Same for Latinos. Latinos of the same age have a lower crime rate than white Americans, by the way. A lot of people don't know that. But I mean, region, more black people live in the South, and test scores. And the test score gap, because of the study issue for white and black urban kids, doesn't really have much to do with racism. It doesn't have much to do with family income. Like the average SAT score, last I looked, for black kids from families that make more than $200,000 a year was like 1,000. It was lower than the average SAT score from Asian kids from families that make $10,000 a year. So there is an element of excuse making to a lot of this. If you adjust for those 3 things, age, region, and scores, the black-white gap closes. And the reason that I harp on this is that it gives you something that you can actually look at and actually fix in the real world. Instead of saying there might be something out there in the system that's affecting black people because I just won't believe we're underperforming against any measure, you can say, well, it seems like African American kids and urban and southern white kids don't study a lot, and if we fixed that, we could probably fix the one thing that's holding back these groups. So we're not doing some kind of arcane wizardry here designed to disguise reality. We're using this pretty simple technique to figure out things that often are true and useful. Let's see if I had one more thing here. Oh, and the other point, so I don't think the 2 options are inferiority and racism because Asians are beating all of us. I don't feel as a black or Celtic American that I'm inferior to our countrymen who originate from the fabled lands of the Far East. But also, if you want to take these metrics against which groups perform, it's pretty easy. I've seen, quote-unquote, Hotep African-American friends of mine do this. I've seen East Asian friends of mine do this. I've seen white friends and acquaintances of mine do this. It's not very difficult to pick those that favor your group. So, I mean, again, in terms of Caucasians, the white suicide rate is 3 to 4 times the black suicide rate. Until very recently, the fentanyl crisis, the white drug overdose rate was 2 to 3 times the black rate. One of you guys might correct me. But it was concentrated in areas like Kentucky. So, I mean, I think in general, one of the problems with the Kendi approach is that what you do is you basically pick an individual discrepancy that happens to disfavor generally black people, sometimes poor people, and you say, well, this is due to prejudice. I refuse to believe it's due to anything else. You could most of the time pick another discrepancy just as easily, alcoholism concentrated among Native Americans, Asian Americans, and say, well, this must be due to some form of hidden prejudice. It just wouldn't fit the paradigm. It wouldn't make any sense. It breaks the model. If all disparities are due to racism, you know, the classic example, why is the NBA 75% black and 20% people from the former USSR? Well, there's just never any explanation given. There's never any provided because there can't be. So, I mean, great points, actually, from the other gentleman on the panel, but I think there are obvious responses. And again, as was said, I want to thank this forum for giving me the chance to provide them. I think very often someone will stand up and eloquently say kind of the conventional, quote-unquote, woke position, and the alternative will be, are you a racist if you disagree with me? No, of course not. The alternative is simply, I think that the 30-year age gap might play a role or something like that. It's really quite a simple reply.
Okay, we're down to the last couple of minutes here, guys, so we take questions from the audience. Lourdes, go ahead.
This is like speed dating. So,
Always hated that.
reparations, monetary reparations, thoughts?
Yes.
You might be surprised.
And let me very quickly address a few things. when we talk about boiling things down to anomalous things, most Nigerians who get to this country are the cream of the crop from Nigeria. Otherwise, they're not allowed to immigrate. So you actually have upper-class Nigerians educationally who are getting here in the first place. That accounts for their success. Asian culture usually is much more intellectual and academically driven than American culture. We simply don't care that much about education. We're an anti-intellectual society. That would explain that. When you talk about scores with black kids, get more black teachers, teaching a curriculum where black people are included. When that happens, that's why HBCUs are so incredibly successful. Black kids see themselves represented, they learn more. Again, reparations, yes, but not just in the form of checks, right? What if we see most African American kids who leave college, they don't leave because of their grades. They leave because of finances. Why? The history of racism has an economic impact in this country. So what if, just for the next 75 years, just to throw a number out there, just for the next 75 years, we allow people who could prove they got some black in them to go to college for free, and they not caught up in the financial stressors that they have trying to work and get through school? What would happen? And a lot of people say, hey, 75 years, that's an incredibly long time. Slavery lasted longer.
My take on reparations actually might surprise some people, but it comes down to basically maybe. I'm not a huge fan of the idea, but it would have to come with some conditions. So when many of the reparations figures I've seen are trotted out like $10 million, it seems like people basically just made them up. You'd have to base that on something like the black-white household wealth gap currently is, I think, $110,000. You'd have to have actual methodologists attribute some percentage of that to racism and then figure out how you're going to pay people. One condition for reparations, though, is if you actually pay people the value of lost wages, lost labor, we can't have any more, race compensation programs. That was once proposed by Charles Krauthammer as the grand bargain. We figure out what everyone's owed, maybe something for natives and Irishmen as well, then that's it. Everyone just competes. I would support that. That's actually a final end to everything we've discussed today.
Wouldn't be the final argument, that's for sure. Lourdes?
And other groups have been granted reparations.
This was just a first step, would be the next argument.
Yes,
ma'am.
Yeah.
Yeah, this one is to Dr. Reilly.
Okay.
Woke was originally coined by progressive black Americans. Why the pushback on blacks being informed, elevated, and conscious of social justice and racial inequity?
I have no problem with that at all. I think that words change meaning over time. I mean, like based, which is the right-wing equivalent of woke, originally meant on crack cocaine. So I think that when people in a debate on CNN say woke and they're 40-year-old businessmen, they don't really mean I'm aware of race politics in New York City at this point. So this is actually an important point because, I mean, like when I mentioned, bantering mostly in a friendly wise with Nina Turner, her argument would be, like, if you say you're anti-woke, you're saying you're anti-black because you're against black people being aware of racism. That's not what Chris Rufo and the dean he's debating mean by the term. So I have no problem with black people being aware of actual racism. I think the contemporary meaning of wokeness extends far beyond that. I'll actually add another point. I think a lot of the things that people that I have friendly debates with on this topic think they know about racism are just nonsense. To give one quick example, the average black man or urban white man thinks that the number of unarmed black men shot by the police in a typical year is 10,000. You can check that out. It's a recent report released by the Skeptic Research Center. The actual number is, I believe, 17. So one of the reasons that race relations are declining in quality is that people believe wildly radical things about the behavior of the other racial groups in this country. And I won't just call out the left here. Donald Trump at one point said that 81% of murders of whites were committed by blacks. I believe that year was 7%. So in the social media era, this actually is a good closing line for me. In the social media era, there's a great deal of nonsense out there. I recommend people go to the library, see what the library and call and response. But I mean, see what reality is. It's not always on the left. Let's be fair, it's not always on the right either. It's often just some mundane monograph that tells you how much women actually make when you adjust for sexism.
One last question. Lourdes, go ahead.
Now that I agree with, brother. Please go read.
DEI corporate programs. Thoughts?
Go ahead, brother. I'll follow up on this because we're probably going to agree.
This is it.
Well, I think, DEI corporate programs, this is one of those where I actually feel that the original intent, which the military does pretty well, isn't bad, but they don't do anything.
Just in a sentence, first of all, I feel the actual operation of DEI is probably negative. Like a lot of the things, like, is definitely negative. I don't know why I'm being polite. Like a lot of the things like privilege walking and so on, there's no way that works well. I've been on trading floors that have done this, that kind of thing. But the basic idea of get along with your diverse coworkers, good. I would recommend people, while we talk about reading, check out Harvard Business Review 2016. They looked at every diversity program that then existed, total quality, managing diversity. I see people nodding that have been through some of these, businesswomen in the room. I mean, they didn't do anything. So they had a slight negative effect among white males and African-American women, both of whom just felt insulted. For everyone else, like some Asian stock markets guy, it was neutral. So I don't think they do anything. I do think they make a lot of money for what's now about 4% of the consulting industry.
On this, we agree.
Great close.
DEI, the spirit of it, for folk who really want an equal and just society, the spirit of it is good. The implementation is horrible. Because what I see happening in most places with DEI, whether it be corporate America or higher education, is this idea of a quick fix, where you're gonna go through these DEI trainings or whatnot, and it's gonna correct everything just automatically. And we're seeing one or two things happen. I've met folk who say they're black folk, who say they're now DEI officers. And I'm like, how the hell did you become a DEI officer? What do you really know about the history or contemporary reality of race? It's something you haven't been interested in. They're hustlers. They're not really qualified. But what some of the corporations and institutions are doing, they're hiring some of these people to do the quick fix because they're not really interested in changing anything, the corporations and the institutions. Another type of DEI person that we're seeing pop up a lot is the weakest, most milquetoast, don't want to rock the boat black person that predominantly white institutions can find. And they're gonna do nothing but parrot what their bosses are saying. They want the position, but they don't want to have any conversations about real structural change. The third situation is you actually have somebody who knows what they're doing, and they're put into these positions where corporations and institutions absolutely under-resource them. They turn them into offices of one. They're not serious about change, and the people who know what they're doing, they either get burned out really, really fast, disillusioned, or they leave. So I don't care what you call it. I was working on equality before this DEI stuff popped up. There is no quick fix to equality. There is no quick fix to structural racism. And if you really want to change it, then you get with some people who are serious about it, and you're not going to hire people who are serious about it and support them if you're not serious about it. So that's my feeling. So DEI, as it's being done right now, DEI doesn't need to be eradicated, because that's what Ron DeSantis and Christopher Rufo are doing down in Florida when you talk about higher education. It doesn't need to be eradicated, but it needs to be reworked.
Dr. Ricky Jones, Dr. Wilfred Reilly. Great conversation.
Thank you. On behalf of the Louisville Forum, thank you all so much for being with us today. I feel like we could have had maybe another hour or two to cover this topic. I feel like we just scratched the surface, but thank you all so much for your time. Mark your calendars. Our next meeting will be on Wednesday, July 12th. We will be announcing the program in the coming days, so please be on the lookout for that message. Also want to note for non-members, starting next month, the registration fee will be $30 for attendance. Again, more information can be found on louisvilleforum.org. Thank you all for joining us today, and have a great day.
Give it up for Iris. Great job.